Hello and welcome to another short drawing lesson. This week I thought I'd talk you through this little study that I did in Procreate on the iPad of a rather sad looking Porsche 356. Along the way you might pick up a few useful Procreate tips or just general sort of painting ideas and things. So let's have a look at the first step. So the first thing I did was a blob. I didn't do any kind of line drawing to start with. This is the thing I would usually do if I was sketching a car, is do a line drawing, sometimes quite a detailed one, and then the colour would be the last thing once I was happy with the drawing. But in this case, I'm trying to approach it more like a painter would, and just looking at shapes and the values and the colours of those shapes. So in this case, I was looking at the basic blob of the car, so how long is it, how tall is it, where are the openings for these wheel arches? And then when I came to the cab on top, where does the pillar line up with the wheel arch below? Where are the openings for the lights? That kind of thing. But it's all just one flat colour, and I'm not worrying too much about the edges. I'd like this to be kind of painterly in feel. So I'm using a big flat brush and leaving the edges quite rough. But the main thing is just to get this simple shape down as a flat blob. The next thing on a new layer behind that one is to put in the floor. And again, it's just a flat colour, and I'm just looking at the shape of the shadow cast onto the floor. And that's quite useful because it starts to make the car feel a bit more three-dimensional, because you can start to imagine a plane and a 3D thing sitting on it. So again, no shading at this stage. And then I did the same thing for the rear side of the car, and the insides of the wheel arches and the cabin, the far side of that, where are those pillars and things? Because again, it just slightly increases the feeling of a 3D object again. So it's no longer just a flat blob, it's now a slightly maybe a 2.5D blob. At this same stage, I used my eraser to cut out any openings that were there in the front, the headlights, the air vents, the bonnet, which is not quite seated in its opening, any things like that, and filled in the background of those dark as well. Now was the sort of step where I could start thinking about actually adding some variation to those different layers. So I went back to the floor shadow, and looking at the reference, I noticed that the edges were slightly bluer than the really deep underneath stuff. And that's because although this is a shadow and it's not actually getting any direct sunlight, the warm sunlight from the sun, it is still being lit by the blue sky which is all around. So that blueness of the sky is just lightening the shadow, mostly at the edges. So there's more of that there. But obviously that doesn't get right deep down in the crevices there, where it becomes very black and less blue. So that was the first little thing I noticed. I did the same thing then with the wheel arches, looking at which bits are bluer and which bits are warmer and which are darker and which are lighter, and work my way around doing those sorts of things in the openings for the lights and whatnot. Then I turned my attention to the actual blob of the car to give that some form. And the car was a black car, so I could treat it mostly as a monochrome study. It did have a lot of orange rust on it, but I thought I'd ignore that for now and just concentrate on trying to get a nice form that feels three-dimensional. So how much lighter should these top surfaces be than the side surfaces, and how does that transition from light to dark as the curve happens? Those kind of things. Not worrying about colour makes that quite a lot easier at that stage. I used the flat brush as a smudge brush just to blend in some of those side gradients and make them a little less perfect. And then I did my first sort of clever Procreate trick to add the rust. I did that on a separate layer on top of the car blob, but I used a clipping mask. So a clipping mask is a useful thing. So here's my car blob, and I could make and here's the rust layer on top. So it's quite nice to be able to switch it on and off and to be able to work on it without destroying the work you put into the layer underneath. So I'll make a new one, and all you do is make a layer above the layer that you want to adjust. Go in the menu, tick on clipping mask. So here's your clipping mask. You'll get this little arrow at the side. And what that does is it allows you to draw on your new layer, but it will only let you paint in the area where there's something on the layer beneath. So that's a really good way of just adding some colour changes and things to whatever's underneath. And it's a non-destructive thing because you can switch it on and off or erase into it. So that's your first useful tip. There is another way of doing that directly onto your layer. So if you select your car blob and swipe it with 2 fingers, it makes the transparent areas masked basically, so you can't draw on the transparent areas. So you get exactly the same effect, but the difference for this one is that it is actually on your car layer and not removable easily unless you undo. So back to our step by step. So I was looking at my black shaded layer underneath to give me clues as to how bright or dark my rust layer should be. I noticed a lot of the top surfaces had a lot of this warm dust colour in them because dust had settled on the top surfaces over the years. And then I went onto the trim of the car. So I just got a medium grey to start with, started a new layer on top of everything and drew in the shapes for the trim. So where headlight surrounds, bumpers, this bit here at the bottom of the door. And then again, preserved the transparency of it, so I couldn't change the outlines, and looked carefully at the reference to see how the colour changed in different parts of those bits of trim. Bits that faced upwards towards the blue sky often had a bluish tinge, and bits that faced downwards towards the floor had this sort of warmish sandy colour. So it was quite fun just to start giving them a bit of colour variation. And then also adding the highlights, which always give the picture a bit of a pop and make it sparkle and look a bit more interesting. The next step was to have a look at smaller details. I'd sort of avoided those up to this point, trying to just concentrate on big shapes. But you work your way gradually down to smaller and smaller stuff. So now I'm at the point where I'm thinking about shut lines, door handles, tiny bits of trim that have fallen down in the roof, the little highlights that catch on the edges of these curves, that kind of thing, and a few specks of dust and dirt and scratches. You don't have to go crazy and do all of them, just a few gives you the impression that there's much more detail there than there really is. There was a little shadow I added here because the door wasn't quite shut completely. And then I had a look at the glass that was still in there. It didn't have glass in all the windows, but just a milky colour on its own layer and then erased to fit the openings. Gave you a good feeling of a dusty window. And you could erase a bit more where the shadows were just to let those sort of darken off a bit. Same for the glass in the back window there. I added a few specks of dust to that. I noticed it was just a little bit flat looking, so I increased the brightness on the top surfaces there. A bit more of this dusty colour was added to the top surfaces, and that just made the car feel a bit more solid. And there was a nice step here where I took my square brush as a smudge brush and dragged it downwards as if the rust had streaked from the rain over the years. It sort of run down the car. That was a really fun step. And then last of all, I had another look at my background, which was very flat and boring. It was just a single colour. So I used the square brush but with a jitter effect. So I'll show you that now. If I go to my background layer, or make a new layer, here's my normal flat brush. Here's the same brush with colour jitter added. So if you go to settings, you'll notice in the colour dynamics, the hue is turned up to just 6%. And that means that every time I draw a stroke, it's slightly varied. It's never the same colour twice. It just means that you get an interesting sort of colour variation, it's great for a big flat area that can be a bit boring without it. And obviously you don't want to go too far with that. If you increase it too much, up to, let's put 64%, then you get a completely different colour every time, which is definitely less useful. But just at 6% or something like that, you get a nice amount of just a slight variation without changing your colour too much. So I added that to the background and added a few warms and cools. Then I thought I could add a bit more and added this kind of dark shape behind that's a bit indistinct. And it just serves to create a couple of layers and add a bit more depth, I think. And that's pretty much the image finished. I hope you found that useful. Do join me on Patreon if you'd like to see the full hour-long live stream version. Otherwise, like and subscribe. Have a fantastic week, and I'll see you for another one soon.